What's up, iWit crew? It's the Raven, here to share with you another shocking, interesting, or strange, but very true story. Today we're looking at 3 photos with disturbing backstories. Before we get started, I'll warn you that the cases we're covering are disturbing, and they're only going to get more chilling as we go. Out of the 3 pictures we're looking at today, this is the one that you might have seen, but if you haven't, I'm certain that you've heard about the disaster that happened just moments after the picture was taken. Since the case is widely known, we're going to talk about some of the little-known facts I'm sure will surprise you. This picture is one that's filled with the excitement of a new adventure. It shows the crew of the STS-51L as they smile and wave to those who excitedly gather to watch. In fact, tons of people congregated around their TVs on January 28, 1986, eager to watch the historic moment. The mission itself was routine, the transportation of cargo and crew from Earth to orbit, but it was also the final flight of the Space Shuttle Challenger. As you can see in the picture, 5 astronauts and 2 payload specialists made up the crew of 7. The crew included 37-year-old Krista McAuliffe, who was making history as the first civilian teacher in space. McAuliffe was picked out of more than 11,000 other applicants to the NASA program. Someone you probably didn't know who was considered to join the Challenger crew was Big Bird. That's right, from Sesame Street. Big Bird was seriously considered to be on the shuttle, but the plan never went through. If it had, though, what happened next would have been even more traumatizing for the children watching across America. Everyone boarded the Challenger, and I think you know exactly what happened next. Almost all of us know the horrific fate of the Challenger on that final flight. The crew was cleared for their mission, and Commander Francis Scobie gave the now haunting command of Go Throttle. The mission seemed certain to succeed, especially because the shuttle had already completed 9 successful missions. Seconds later, NASA heard one final message from the Challenger. Marked pilot Michael Smith, who was on his first space flight, only uttered the words, "Uh-oh," before all the electronic communication with the space shuttle was lost. Many people think that the crew of the Challenger had no idea that anything was wrong until it was too late, but Smith clearly did. Everyone on the ground was hopeless to do anything. They stared up in horror. One second, the crowd was cheering at the feeling of the blast from the launch as the Challenger rose up into the sky. The next second, everyone was quiet. It took a few moments for people to realize what happened. NASA personnel caught on first, staring up with tears in their eyes. Mission Control managed to say, "Obviously, a major malfunction has occurred." Only 73 seconds into the launch, the Challenger erupted into a huge ball of flames when it reached around 48,000 feet above the Earth's surface. On the ground, all anyone could see was huge plumes of white and flames above them. Understanding of what happened was slow, with most of the crowd frowning up into the sky. When people realized that the Challenger was coming back down, but in pieces, people started crying, screaming, covering their mouths in horror. Then someone asked what everyone was wondering, "Where are they?" And someone else responded, "Dead. We've lost them." One of the greatest tragedies was the fact that almost all of the loved ones of the Challenger's crew were on the ground at the time of the launch, staring up and helpless as the shuttle broke into pieces right before their eyes. Especially tragic was the Christmas call of 2 children had been brought to the roof of the Launch Control Center so that they could have the best view to see their mother make history. McAuliffe had taken her son's frog stuffy and her daughter's cross and chain in the shuttle with her for good luck. 9-year-old Scott and 6-year-old Carolyn McAuliffe would have seen the explosion with disturbing clarity. And they weren't the only children to watch from the ground as their parents horrifically died. The burning shuttle continued upwards for another 25 seconds, before it eventually plummeted into the Atlantic. The wreckage then continued upwards for another 25 seconds before it eventually. The wreckage then scattered over the ocean east of Florida. To all the shocked people watching, it looked like the Challenger exploded, And actually, that's one of the biggest misconceptions about the Challenger disaster. NASA called it an explosion, so did the media, so do many people in years after, and even I thought it exploded, but it didn't technically explode. So what actually happened? Well, it erupted in flames and broke into pieces. A seal in the shuttle's right solid-fuel rocket booster, which was meant to prevent leaks from the tank, weakened in the frigid temperatures and failed. Then hot gas began pouring through the leak, collapsing the fuel tank and ripping it apart. Then it all burst into flames. The flood of liquid oxygen and hydrogen created the huge fireball that tore the Challenger into pieces over the heads of the horrified crowd. Another misconception is that when the Challenger erupted in flames and broke apart, everyone on board had been killed instantly. In fact, NASA had insisted that the crew died instantly, probably because the alternative was too horrible to consider. But sadly, it's the truth. At a report 6 months later, it was revealed that the crew cabin had actually remained intact as it ripped away from the rest of the shuttle. Because of this, the Challenger's crew had actually survived the initial breakup of the shuttle, despite what most people believe today. In March 1986, the remains of the crew cabin were found by Navy divers about 18 miles from the launch site in about 100 feet of water. Inside the crew cabin were the remains of the crew, and only some of them could be identified. Those who were then given back to their families, and those who weren't were buried in a monument. But the deaths of the Challenger crew are probably way more horrifying than you may have thought. The shuttle ripping apart didn't have a force strong enough to kill or even seriously injure the crew. Instead, most were probably still alive when they started to fall. And not only that, but they were also probably conscious. The crew cabin had air packs, which contained several minutes of air for an emergency, and 3 of the air packs were opened in the wreckage, showing that at least some of the crew was conscious in the fall. The crew cabin fell at more than 200 miles per hour, and it's been theorized that the drop in pressure within the cabin maybe knocked the crew unconscious so that they weren't awake when they tragically crashed into the water. But sadly, if this were true, the mid-deck floor of the space shuttle would have been torn up by the change in pressure, and it wasn't. Horrifyingly, it seems that the crew would have been aware of the last terrifying moments of their lives. The cabin hit the water surface about 2 minutes and 45 seconds after the shuttle tore into pieces, and they could have known what was happening that whole time. Those almost 3 minutes would have been petrifying. For sure, though, the impact with the ocean was unsurvivable as well, even if they had miraculously survived, which I was really sad to learn was essentially impossible. The shuttle doesn't have an escape hatch, so they wouldn't have been able to get out anyway. What most people don't know is that the crew of 7 were the first Americans to die during a spaceflight since NASA began in 1958. Now, here's the scariest part of all. The disaster was predicted to happen. The night before the launch, 5 engineers told NASA to delay the mission because they knew the O-ring seals would fail in cold conditions, and the launch was set in the coldest place of any shuttle launch to date. One engineer, Bob Eberling, said to his wife that he thought the Challenger would blow up, and he was tragically right. To this day, Eberling blames himself for what happened and thinks he could have done more to make people listen to him. But ultimately, it wasn't his decision for the Challenger to still launch that day. The great misconception about the Challenger disaster is that a horrified crowd of millions all collectively watched as it happened live. But this wasn't the case at all. The launch was at 11:39 a.m. on a Tuesday, a time when many people were at work and not seated around the TV to watch the historic launch. As well, all of the main networks covering the launch cut away from the footage the moment the shuttle broke apart to spare viewers from witnessing the horror. Far less people actually saw the moment live than we usually think. Instead, most watched the shocking replays of the accident hours after it had happened. But even with this in mind, there was a horrifying twist, because NASA had wanted to share the historic event with schools, so they set up satellite broadcasts onto TV sets in classrooms. This was mostly done because McCullough, a teacher, was part of the crew, and it meant that even though many people didn't see the Challenger go up in flames live, hundreds of school children did instead. A teacher, recalling the moment that she watched the live feed with her students on the small TV set, said that right after the explosion, all the kids went quiet, unsure of what they just saw, and then they all started asking the same question: were all those people on the shuttle dead? She had to tell them yes. To this day, many of those who watched the disaster in school are still horrified about what they saw. When looking to explain the disaster, many people pointed to the pressure that NASA was under to complete the Challenger's mission. And this was true. There had been many delays, and they were looking to make up for some of the difficulties they had faced when trying to get their previous shuttle, the Columbia, back on the ground. After an investigation, it was ruled that NASA violated launch rules on purpose. It was too cold, and they knew about the O-ring seal's tendency to fail in low temperatures. But there was also a worry about the fuel. Despite all of this, they went ahead with the launch, which intentionally violated the rules. However, a few rumors went even further to actually point the blame on Ronald Reagan's White House. They believed that he demanded that the shuttle launch in time with his State of the Union speech, and because he wanted the space program to look successful, which it wouldn't if a launch was canceled. But there's no real evidence that there was direct pressure intentionally placed on them to hurry up with the launch and therefore rush them before they were ready. In fact, Reagan's State of the Union was postponed the first time a president did this, just so he could address the Challenger accident. Reagan also formed a commission to determine the cause of the disaster and even appointed Neil Armstrong as a vice chairman and included Sally Ride, the first American woman in space, to help with the inquiry. A little-known fact about the Challenger is that 2 pieces of the shuttle were found a decade after all the important pieces were recovered. The wreckage that was recovered was buried in an abandoned Minuteman missile silo near Cape Canaveral Air Station, but most of the spacecraft remained in the Atlantic Ocean, about 50% of it, since it was too costly and difficult to remove, and there was always a chance that pieces could wash ashore. And that's exactly what happened. In 1996, 20 miles south of the Kennedy Space Center on Cocoa Beach, 2 barnacle-encrusted pieces of the shuttle were found by someone walking along the sand.